Amanda Janoo, a political outsider whose progressive platform captured the imagination of primary voters, is Vermont's Democratic nominee for governor.
As an economist, I know that money is power. But as a Vermonter, I know that money is not the only kind of power. Knowledge is power, trust is power, democracy is power, and community is power. And you should never underestimate the power of a group of Vermonters who decide to do something together.
Plus, former Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray gets the chance to ask voters for her old job back and a closer look at second home taxes. All that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintilac Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Hi, I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, August 14th. And with us on the panel today, we have Lola Duffort from Vermont Public, Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, and Carly Berlin from Vermont Public. Thank you all so much for being here. This is the time of year when those of us who are into politics and love watching the horse races and stuff can really get excited, because now we've moved on from the primary in Vermont. We know who's going to be challenging for the governorship now. And I have to ask right out of the gate, you guys, I mean, Amanda Janoo, we said she is a political newcomer. She kind of, I think, upset Allie Richards, who was also running to become the Democratic primary governor nominee. Is this an upset in your mind? If so, how big an upset? Kevin, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, this is someone who was a political unknown in the state as of March. No one knew who this was. And frankly, people that I knew were referring to her as Amanda Janoo. I mean, they really didn't know her name, and they didn't understand where she was coming from. And she very quickly got momentum and got the fundraising that was able to put her in a position that was surprising to many people. She was outspent, essentially 2-to-1 if you add up some of the PAC money that was spent by Allie Richards. And so, yeah, I think starting from that place and beating an opponent who was much better financed, it definitely qualifies as a win.
This is a question more, Lola Duffort, of what Amanda Janoo did right or what Allie Richards perhaps did wrong, do you think?
I think both. I think, sure, this was an upset. I think Allie Richards was a weaker candidate than the establishment considered her to be. And that's just because even if you do impressive things in Montpelier, if you've never held statewide office, the voters don't know who you are, right? Mm-hmm. So she also had no name recognition statewide, right? People in Montpelier knew who Allie Richards was and had no idea who Amanda Janoo was. But basically, for the average person out there, they were kind of equivalent in terms of being an unknown. But I also think, yes, it is also about what Amanda Janoo did right. I think she's clearly a really gifted retail politician. I think you often have an edge if you are the more ideologically committed candidate in a primary, right? I think that's generally the case, but particularly in this moment, right? And so she was able to position herself as the change candidate and kind of plug into this hunger for change that we are seeing in the Democratic primary electorate nationwide, right? And so I think those two things really propelled her to a narrow but victory.
I'm really curious about that phrase, retail politician. What do you mean by that when you speak about Amanda Janoo?
Yeah, so I thought Amanda Janoo would win because she was, putting herself forward as this change candidate. But I went to her election night party, and I was really struck by what I heard from the folks that had come out. Number one, I didn't really recognize people, right?
Yeah.
And so it was not the usual power brokers. It was not the usual suspects that you see at election night parties. I was like, this is someone who has actually built a new power base. But the people who I talked to spoke about how, she went to their towns and she asked them, what's going right? What do you think we should be doing? And really listened to them. I heard multiple voters tell me, not only did she listen to me, but she was writing down my answers in a little notebook. And I think the most effective politicians kind of connect with voters on a personal level, right? And she has clearly demonstrated that she is able to do that. And I think that's rare. And so I think, charisma is, I think, a huge part of what's led her to have the success that she has had so far in the primary.
And I also think that it's interesting that I don't know that Allie did a very good job of pointing out some of the holes in Amanda's policies and ideas. Right, early on, they made a commitment that they would not go negative, that they would run a positive, supportive campaign of one another. They would be collegial. And I think that was probably the right move, right? Voters didn't really want to see two Democratic women attacking each other in this primary, right? So they said, okay, we're just running a positive campaign. But I think maybe Allie ran too positive a campaign, right? She did not take the time to say things about Amanda's ideas that were flawed. And there's a lot of them. There's a lot of questions about how she's going to implement a lot of the progressive ideas that she's articulated. And I think if Allie had done a better job of going on the attack, essentially, of explaining why she felt that some of Amanda's policies were flawed or overly optimistic or lacked detail or are unaffordable, I think voters might have taken a closer look at Amanda and had some of those questions themselves.
Well, some of those questions then, do you think those are going to come up in the general now as she goes up against Phil Scott?
Absolutely. No, I mean, that's going to be job number one of the press and of Phil Scott's team of raising questions about the things that Amanda says she wants to do and pointing out that there are ideas, but they're not plans, right? And there's no money, essentially, or extremely difficult to get the money to do the things that she's talked about. And Lola knows these things super well.
Well, so I think we can pretty safely predict that what Phil Scott is going to do is try and raise a whole bunch of questions about her plans, right? Because she's been specific about her promises, right? She's been like, this is who I'm going to tax and this is what I'm going to do with it. And so I think he and the media will also ask a lot of questions about sort of whether those two things, right? Like what I want to do and who I'm going to tax, whether or not those numbers actually mesh. And Carly has also done some really good reporting about the second home tax question, which has been floated by basically every major Democrat so far in this election. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit later. And then I think what Amanda Janoo will do, right, and what the media will do, will be try and examine his record, right, on all of these things that have been festering in the state, including probably the biggest thing will be healthcare, right? Yeah. So she's proposing universal primary care. She's going to face a lot of questions about like her financing system. And then I think he's also going to face a lot of questions about the fact that he's been governor for 10 years and by any objective measure and his own admission, we're in a really bad place when it comes to housing and healthcare affordability.
We also heard day after the election, high-level Vermont Republicans saying this is a relief. We think Janoo is an easier candidate to beat than Richards, right? And I think, part of that, to what Kevin was saying earlier, is, Janoo really differentiated herself more from Phil Scott than Allie Richards did as a more centrist candidate. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to play into the dynamics we see in the general and what gets lodged from both sides, too.
Yeah, go ahead, Lola.
I was about to say, I think the Republicans probably are kind of explicitly doing cartwheels. They're like, this is great. She'll be easier to beat. We can paint Democrats as out of touch and just, totally disconnected from what everyday Vermonters think we should be doing here. But particularly the progressive wing of the Democratic Party wants to press this argument, right? Wants to say, actually, we think that what is considered electable is changing, right? And that people want outside the box thinking and want to propose these big ideas. And I think, to me, both scenarios are totally plausible. One where like Scott dispenses with her, much like he did I think he won't do quite as well as he did against his last two opponents, say. Mm-hmm. But like it's super easy and, she doesn't put a dent in him. I also see a scenario where she does a lot better than expected. And that's because she has been able to build like real excitement around her campaign and her ideas. And so I don't necessarily think that she would be easier to beat than Allie Richards, because Allie Richards was never able to generate sort of momentum.
But what momentum Allie did generate, she has said she's going to pledge that to help Amanda get elected very clearly. And people say that all the time, right, after a primary, that they're going to be unified and they're going to together. But you really got the sense from Richards that she's going to do everything she can and urge her supporters to really rally and get behind Amanda. So I think you're absolutely right, Lola, that I don't think it's going to be a blowout. I think Amanda's going to do very well, and she's going to give Phil Scott a challenge that he hasn't had in a long time.
Well, I want to follow up on that a little bit, because we have talked so many times on this program about Phil Scott's phenomenal popularity numbers. I mean, he really has enjoyed some of the most support of any governor in the country at one time, I think being called the most popular. My question is, though, I think they did, and I'm just speculating here, but I did think Scott's camp expected Allie Richards to win this primary. Is there any sense that any of you get that maybe they are a little nervous to what Lola was saying, that Amanda Janoo did win this primary, and maybe they're thinking, maybe there is, especially in the state of Vermont, this groundswell now behind candidates who are all in on change, that maybe Scott is more vulnerable than he's been in the past?
I think the poll numbers show that he is more vulnerable than he has been in the past. But I think, like what Lola was saying, that the election of Amanda Janoo gives them some comfort that vulnerability is not necessarily something she's going to be able to fully exploit.
So the Democrats that have supported Scott in the past will still do so, you think? He's gotten a lot of support from Democrats here in the state of Vermont.
Well, remember, Amanda Janoo's political platform has a lot of tax increases in it. And there's a lot of wealthy or well-off or moderate income Democrats who are not super excited about seeing their taxes raised, even if it's meant to go to all these laudable, healthcare or childcare or school initiatives, right? So yeah, there's going to be a significant number of conservative and moderate Democrats who are doing okay themselves and don't see the need to upend the system, and will probably still continue to support Phil Scott.
All right, well, we'll certainly find out. Another race that was kind of fascinating because of the way it turned out was the race for lieutenant governor in the state of Vermont. Molly Gray won easily in this one. Are we shocked at all about that one? Lola, let me start with you.
No, not surprised. I guess a little bit surprised by her margin of victory, because her opponent, the one who came in second, Ryan McCallum, had a ton of money behind him, and a sitting U.S. senator, appearing on television ads saying, this is the guy you want to elect to the lieutenant governor's office. But, she came in with a huge name recognition advantage. And it's really hard to overcome that, especially because he was never able to really create much to distinguish himself, right? To explain, this is why I would be so different from Molly Gray. And they're both, they supported the same, much of the same policies, right? They had their little pet policy differences, but nothing major. And they're both kind of fundamentally, pretty insidery, right? He worked for Peter Welsh for a decade. And so it was not surprising that she won.
60%, though, of the vote, Ryan McCallum, 27%. That's not just a win, that's kind of a rout.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a big one. Is there anything that you see in Molly Gray getting this lieutenant governor's job? She's been in and out of politics, different jobs, as Lola was referring to, that says that she's looking at a more ambitious office down the line. Well,
I don't know about that, but I do know that this means that in the general election, she's heading into her fight with John Rogers with a good head of steam built up behind her. And I think this means that she's probably, we saw a poll that shows that she was, I don't forget the number, she was at least 15 points above John Rogers in a general election contest. And so, yeah, she takes that 60%, 61% of the vote from the primary into the general, and I think puts him in a very difficult spot. If she gets that job, if she's lieutenant governor again, well, what does that mean for her future? Well, I think it's bright, right? She already has had a run for Congress that didn't go her way, but she got the name recognition for that effort. She got dinged for some of the things she did in that election, but she showed that she was a person who could run a campaign like that, and she had big name backers behind it. And I would imagine that if she becomes lieutenant governor again after a couple of terms, right, she probably would look to either go to the governor's seat or to D.C. I mean, that just makes sense to me.
As you say, though, she's got to get past John Rogers first. What do you expect? I mean, John Rogers came out swinging pretty hard right after she won the primary, right? Didn't he have a statement?
Yeah, I think he's worried. Right? He's only been a lieutenant governor for one term. And I don't think he's done a lot of things that have caused Vermonters to be like, oh my God, did you hear what the lieutenant governor said, or what he did, or an initiative that they are getting behind? So, and then, hours after her victory, he puts out a statement that says the things that he cares about, right? About, affordability and property rights and various things. And then he tries to tie Molly to the, do-nothing lawmakers in Montpelier, which is funny because John Rogers was a lawmaker for 20 years in Montpelier. He's, been in Montpelier for a long, long time. Admittedly, not on the progressive, not a supporter of progressive causes, but to try to tie Molly Gray to the do-nothing lawmakers in Montpelier, I think is odd, but it really shows that he's concerned.
We had some other races we could talk about. Gerald Malloy became the Republican nominee for the U.S. House, beating Mark Kerster pretty handily as well. Kevin, I know that you were interviewing Mark Kerster for a while. Why did Gerald Malloy come out on top on this one, do you think? Well,
I just think Mark Kerster is a fringe candidate, right? He's a logger from Westminster who got into using or helping use these AI-generated videos to attack, Becca Balint, these just comical videos of, him picking her up in an excavator and dropping her in a dumpster and just kind of wacky things. And Malloy's not a very strong candidate, I don't think, against Balint either, but this wasn't much of a contest for him.
Yeah, we don't think Becca Balint has much to worry about in this race.
I doubt it.
Yeah, I would sort of doubt that too. I was really fascinated by the race for Chittenden County State's attorney. Sarah George was reelected. She was facing a pretty strong primary challenge from Bram Cronefeld, who outspent her by quite a bit, I think by $100,000 or so. But it looks like folks in Chittenden County are saying that they want Sarah George to continue her progressive reforms, things like restorative justice, ending cash bail, and things like that. So she will still have to win the general election, of course, but she has won the Democratic primary there. In the legislature, it looks like it's a good time to be a Senate incumbent, right? I mean, they all did rather well there.
Yeah, no, there's absolutely. There's no real news to report essentially out of the Democratic primaries. All the incumbents in the Senate certainly, kept their seats, and we didn't actually spend a lot of time in the news corps in the press corps following those races closely because all the attention was on the lieutenant governor and the governor's race. Yeah,
I'll give you a quick update on that. Their reelection bid in the primary. Closely watched Chittenden County Central race saw newcomer Nikhil Goyal, who managed a record-shattering fundraising haul. He won, clinched first place in a 3-seat race where incumbent senators Tanya Vyhovsky and Martine Gulick also prevailed. So we got a little bit of a update there. You're caught up with that. I wanted to talk about something, a vote that was taken, and this deals with school closures. In the Washington Central District, the voters greenlit a new process. It shifts decision-making for school closures to the entire district rather than individual schools. And this follows a recent closure votes in Worcester and in Calais. Lola Duffort, what does this mean now for voters? Like, if you have a small school and you wanted that school to close, other districts, though, other towns can make that decision for that town, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this shows that if you want to close a school, you are not going to be able to have. Usually, you need someone other than that town to vote for it, right? Like, people do not like to close their own schools. However, and I think that this is important has been a really interesting and undercovered part of this debate. Some of the folks kind of leading the charge to close Calais Elementary were Calais parents, right? And something that I covered education consolidation debates for like 10 years. And what I have noticed now versus then is that there are a growing number of parents who are supportive of consolidation. And I don't know or necessarily think that they're the majority. I think that parents and community members are increasingly divided on this. And that kind of shows up in things too, like when they poll Phil Scott's favorability numbers, right? The number one thing that people cite about what they don't like about what he's been doing is his handling of education. But one of the number one things people cite as something that they like that he's been doing is his handling of education. And so I think that tells you, or it suggests to me, that this is not something that Vermonters are monolithic about and actually like really profoundly disagree about. And that's really interesting.
And it's
obviously going to be incredibly hard to reconcile, right? Because these are completely opposing visions.
Yeah, and we're not anywhere near a closure on how the entire education reform system is all going to shake out at this point. It's kind of happening as we're speaking. Yeah,
well, I guess if I had to take a wild prediction, I would say that the big historic education reform bill that they passed last year will only ever remain, a big change in law will probably not actually come to pass.
I got a feeling we're going to be talking about that for sure in the future. You had mentioned that we're going to be talking about Carly's recent story on second home taxes. And I want to get into that, Carly, because this is kind of fascinating. All the Democratic governor primary candidates were for this tax on second homes. What is the proposal here, and what do Democrats, including Amanda Janoo, think we can get from this?
It really depends which of these 5 candidates you ask, actually, in the governor's and lieutenant governor's race. This was a big theme in the Democratic primary. And there are sort of 3 main goals here. One is to boost housing supply, right, by getting second homes back into the primary residence market. 2 is to lower tax bills for primary residents. And 3 is to raise revenue for a whole bunch of different kinds of programs, depending on which candidate you ask, building more affordable housing, funding universal primary care, as we've talked about. So the idea here is broad, light on specifics from many of these candidates, Janoo included. But this is really, one of these themes that we heard candidates coming back to throughout this primary campaign season as a way to, try to solve a lot of different problems in Vermont at once.
Is there any indication of just how much money could be raised? I mean, I know it's a difficult question.
It's a difficult question on 2 fronts, right? Because we don't know exactly what this tax base would be. The estimates we have for how many second homes there are vary really wildly if we're talking about census data, about 50,000 homes in Vermont. Tax department data suggests 70,000. That also is dependent on, are we talking about hunting camps, things that wouldn't necessarily be fit for year-round use? Just defining what we're talking about is a matter of debate here.
Yeah, because when I hear second homes, I think big homes. That's what pops into my mind. That's not necessarily the case. Yeah.
And, the second piece here is what's the tax rate? And that is, a decision by the legislature. The legislature sets tax rates. And, as part of education reform talks over the last few years, there's been movement towards creating a basically second home tax classification, piece in our tax law right
now. Define it, right.
Exactly, because right now we have, homestead taxes for primary residences and non-homestead for everything else. So you've got rental housing, you've got farms, you've got businesses in that column.
Right. Now we have no way to tax second homes without taxing everything else that is not a primary residence, right? And so because we have no category, we do not have a second home tax category in our tax code. We don't know how many second homes there are, and we don't know how much money we could actually raise from a second home. From a second home tax. And so what that means is that in the absence of this information, right, people are projecting all of their hopes and dreams on this second home tax, which is wildly popular. The polling on second home taxes shows that Republicans love this, Democrats love this. Everyone loves a tax that they don't think they're going to have to pay, right?
That's kind.
And also we have this weird relationship with tourism in Vermont where we like both love it, but also we resent the fact that, it sometimes hollows out our communities. And so it's been, and this goes back to, what you were talking about before. There are a lot of hopes and dreams pinned on this. And sometimes the numbers that people put out there, including Amanda Janoo, you mentioned this in your story, said, I think we could raise $1 billion off the second home tax. And then, when the media went to her and were like, where did that come from? It was like, well, it's just a rough estimate. Yeah. Very, very rough. And so I think that, I think as folks think about sort of, if we want to do this, I think it's also important to ask for specifics about what we do and do not know before we sort of spend money that could be theoretical.
I want to quickly wrap this by asking you, Carly Berlin, about 30 seconds here. What is Governor Phil Scott's view on second home taxes?
He's not a fan. He says no new taxes. His vision is let's grow the tax base, have more taxpayers to bring down that primary residence rate for everybody.
Well, that's just one topic that's going to be bandied about. We've got about 80 days until the general election, so strap in. And we're, of course, going to keep you updated on all of this. So we'll leave it there for this week. Thanks to our panel, Lola Duffort from Vermont Public, Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, and Carly Berlin from Vermont Public, whose reporting is presented in partnership with VT Digger. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. We'll see you next Friday for Vermont This Week.